Ça démarre, mais je pourrais couper, donc ne t'inquiète pas. So, Jan, we are going to talk about the Tio Kingdom today, and we were just recapitulating when and how you wrote this book. So, it coincided with revolutions in Congo-Kinshasa, and you couldn't go back to the Cuba region at the time. So, I'll let you explain what happened at that time.
You see, this is a book that came about as a result of a miracle. The miracle was that I was then teaching at UW here, and suddenly I was announced that one of the granting agencies of the main foundations had too much money.
Oh, and welcome to America!
In 1963, and they had decided that since they had more money than what they thought give to people for research, they just gave me. I think it was $3,000, and I could
without you even asking.
And I could do without. I didn't even do anything, and I could do what I wanted with it, but it had to be research. So at the same time, I was moving from here back to Belgium.
Oh, this was the time when you were moving back
and
to
so
Belgium.
Here, theoretically, I was on 1 year leave. And in Belgium, and Britain, the two jobs, in Britain somebody had a job in mind for me, and I didn't like it, so I didn't take it. In Belgium, I had a job in mind, but the offer was not acceptable, so I turned that down too.
Okay.
And
what was the job in Great Britain?
The job in Great Britain was to teach at SOAS, and it was arranged by Oliver, but it was not. You see, Oliver had simply assumed that he would tell me to go and see such and such a person, and he had already started the whole job process without telling me what I was to do, when I would get leave and so on. And both of these things failed essentially because there was not enough research time in it, and I wasn't interested.
Yeah, compared to UW.
Right. Well, UW was supposedly temporary too, but in any case, the result was that I had time, I had money, and I had a full year, and so I could go to do research in Central Africa, as at the moment Congo-Kinshasa was, in the middle of its second revolution, as it was called at the time.
So what year was it exactly?
1963.
63, okay.
And so that was one thing, but I could go to Congo-Brazzaville, I didn't see why. And in fact, it was useful because in Congo-Brazzaville there was this kingdom that was on a level very little now. It was very, but it was a very old kingdom because it was already mentioned in 1512, 1517, and so it was. I thought that there should be oral traditions there that would be extremely interesting because there were also some written documents to back it up. So of course I was going to study.
Did you hesitate with any other place, or you knew that
this is what I wanted to do, and it was the most sensible place in a sense to go with very short notice, because there was an institution called Ostom. I knew one of its directors in France, who was an historian, and so he wrote a letter of introduction, and basically I simply said I'm coming to do this research, and Ostom agrees as a whole. So I won't need lodge. I won't need to be lodge housed. You don't need housing, but I need some help with logistics, and that was that within 2 weeks.
Wow!
But of course, just at that time, the government in Brazzaville had fallen and had been shoved aside by a coup d'état, and I arrived within a month of that coup d'état, just not long after.
Did you go with Claudine and
yes,
and
I went with Claudine.
And Bruno was born?
No, Bruno was too small. He was left with my family in Wieslow, And we arrived in Congo Brazzaville. Ostom didn't really know what to do with us, but since we were not going to be there a long time, it didn't bother them very much. We had some difficulty with settling in Brazzaville in general, mostly with banks and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
Well, you see, what the banks used to do, and the customers didn't complain, was you would write a check, open an account, write a check, transfer money into it, and normally that money would be there 2 days later, but not in Brazzaville. The banks of Brazzaville had taken the habit of getting the money within 2 days, but then keeping it for themselves for a full month before putting it in the account of their customers. And it's only because the originating banks sent me copies, which arrived by mail, that I could go there and say, this is the money, see, and you've got to give it to me. But in any case, that's not research. Essentially, a week after, 10 days or so after we arrived in Brazzaville, some vehicle of Ostom just went with us to Mbe, dropped us off, and that was that. And we were in the nowhere.
It must have been pretty quiet over there.
No, yes, it was pretty quiet, but we had to find lodgings to begin with.
But did you feel any of the repercussions of the revolution?
Well, in short, the biggest defender of Abe Yulu, who had been overthrown, was this Makoko of Be, mainly because Yulu got his charms there, his charms of power, and nobody seemed to know that, but everybody at Be knew that. So they were obviously not not well remembered in the capital. So, but they were not persecuted either. There was something strange in Be. Congo Brazzaville is a modern society. Congo Brazzaville has just elected its first Marxist government, but its first Marxist government is still afraid of the magical powers that Yulu used.
And the Tio, because Brazzaville used to be a land for the Tio.
Right, and the Tio, and the great Nkobi, that is a great national Tio Shan, Nyangabe. So they left them alone. And in that sense, I was extremely lucky, because on the one hand, look at it this way. On the one hand, the Ostom was not interested in me at all. They saw me as a chore, so they left me alone. Or they left us alone.
Which is very good. So they didn't ask you for any reports or anything?
No, they couldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I was independent in that sense, and in the other sense, they had to pay a little. You see, they had to pay a little attention, because they were always afraid that I might write to some international agency, about the quality of research or the way, whatever, which I wasn't interested in. On the other hand, they were defensive, because they had decided that the next PhD, the next doctorate on the Tio would be won by Marcel Sauret, who was a geographer and who was working for Sauret, for Ostom already for years.
Yeah.
And this was to be his crowning. So, that was competition they had not counted on. But in any case, we arrived in Be. We found housing almost immediately. And, in fact, we were first housed at the maternity. I mean, where else would you find a place? And they had a maternity, so we were there for...
Nancy Hunt know about
She doesn't know about that. And we were there for about 3 or 4 days, and it's a small village. We found housing almost immediately by renting a shop that was still under construction and still had no renter. Nobody had intended to set up shop, so it was just a speculation to build a shop first and see what happened. So we got into that. That was also our housing, and it was interrupted, so it was just the external walls. And then for internal walls, we used some things that we had seen in East Africa, we know from East Africa, which is mats that divide the internal room in places.
What about the roof?
Well,
there was a roof.
There is a roof.
Oh, okay.
And but yeah, and you have a beam. You know, you have a beam that goes from one corner to another, and then you simply have huge mats that you apply, and the jaw made huge mats. They really do, and they use mats.
So you use them as walls,
and we use them as walls, and we use mats as floor.
Oh,
sounds very nice. And that was very, very quickly done. And since it
actually was fairly similar to the Kuba, they also don't the Kuba have this raffia kind of
but they need a more stronger framework, and they need better roofing. You know, it almost never rained in the Job Plateau. It rained, but not very much, and the rain seeped through. It was a major environmental problem, which means that you don't have to worry about drainage. You don't have to worry about humidity on the ground. I mean, all that sort of thing. Yeah. Was taken care of. And it also
very
meant
dry over there.
that from the second day onwards I was there, I could start working right away. And Claudine continued with the matting and with, you know, with buying big baskets for putting the household stuff in, and so on and so forth. So it went really quickly. This is, I lost very, very little time.
It sounds also like happy times with Claudine.
But it was a happy time, you see. First, it was off the beaten road. Secondly, although it was the capital of the kingdom, there were maybe, I think, 100, 120 inhabitants, which made it fairly cozy. Its main modern drawback was that it was a place that people, foreigners, visitors to Brazzaville, like to go to see. They like to go to because the river nearby had the papillon.
Butterflies.
You
won't believe me, but I did that 20 years later. In '84, I went there to see the butterflies.
Right. And you know, these butterflies were really a nuisance when we had to go for water all the time.
Yeah, but the river is nice at this place, actually.
Right, and you had butterfly hunters, and they would set up huge strong lights, you know. But in any case, that was only from time to time. The most interesting part, or annoying part, was that when these visitors came, they brought food from Brazzaville. They ate in bed. Half of the time we were near. We were in very bad conditions because all the guns had been confiscated. There was no more hunting. The harvest of the
by the government, the guns were
by the new government.
Interesting.
So you know, hunting was no longer possible, and the Tjo had guns for such a long time. They no longer used bows and arrows.
And they didn't use traps.
Well, trapping was, you could more or less do it, but it wasn't enough. There was some cassava, but not very much either.
No, because you cannot really also soak it.
Well, it was a problem of soaking on the one hand, but you know, that particular year cassava was bad because there had been a blight, and so there was far fewer food available as usual. And essentially, there were onions. And onions, and more onions. Onions and wild vegetables that, you know, the women would go out into the little woods, the woods are there, and come back with vegetables. But there wasn't all that much. And so that when you saw these people of Brazzaville, they would spread big things on the place, and they would, you know, gobble all sorts of food. Now it was a custom, I take a custom at the time, that when you went to town, you came back from town, you brought back baguettes for, you know, if not everybody, but at least 15 baguettes, you know, to be distributed, more or less. And here you had all these people, you know, eating half a baguette, throwing the rest away, and you know, all the behavior that tourists have, including that they would get into a house and walk around and look everywhere around. And it was extremely difficult to throw them out.
Really?
It's incredible how rude they can be. So, you know, that helped us understand
and
why.
those were European then?
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
Most of them were Frenchmen, but that helped us understand why Congolese can be so, so negative when they see foreigners, because usually there are places of this sort. And later, when I went with the UNESCO committee to Brazzaville, and they brought us to one of the places where there had been prophets in the 1930s and 40s, the people reacted exactly the same. They didn't want.
It's intrusive.
It's extremely intrusive.
Incredible.
But all right, so I was there. I saw this old little person that was the king, which wasn't really very old.
Did you have to ask permission to stay in the village?
And I talked to the village elders, and we first had 2 days of discussion, and then we started this, and we are going to do a quick survey. A quick survey of what people seem to remember about all this rich old history. On the one hand, and on the other hand, I was going to learn the language. So the language sessions went very well. But the sessions about old history, you should have been there, they were strictly nothing.
Really?
Well, I could not use leading questions, and I didn't. But the king remembered nothing. He said, "Oh, I don't remember, nobody told me. I know about Brazza, but that's about it."
And who was giving you lessons? Did you have somebody?
Well, that's easy to teach the language. We found a young man who was also going to be an assistant, who happened to be a nephew of the leading, the head of the largest kinship groups in the village. And all of that seemed to happen just like that, but in reality it was all calculated, of course.
I'm sure, behind your back.
Well, I found out within 2 months, just by taking genealogies, So the language teaching went very well, and it was a language, once again, that was full of surprises. It was unexpected. It was expected to be something like Kikongo, but maybe a bad accent. And when people tell you that it's a bad accent, it means there is something linguistic going on that's important.
So it was a very different language.
It's a very different language, because once again, it is, its phonology is very different.
And you were the first one to really collect words and.
I started the procedure for learning a language, which is the grammar. You start with grammar and vocabulary at the same time, and you do so much every day,
But I mean, nobody had already written some dictionaries?
No, there had been a dictionary in 1893, which nobody had ever used after 1895, because it was supposed to be for use in Brazzaville and in Kinshasa. But the Teke speakers there had been ousted so quickly that by 4 or 5 years later nobody used it anymore.
It's a very interesting case of escapism. They just fled Brazzaville.
And also, that first dictionary was not so bad because it coped with some of the phonetics. For instance, all right, the name Bakongo means people of the Lower Congo. All right, in Tjo, this comes out as Akon, and that is Bakongo. And you can recognize it, but it takes studying the phonemes in a linguistic way. So all of that went fine, there was no problem. But what was I to do for research?
So you were expecting to find oral traditions?
I was expecting to find oral traditions, about the 16th century and the 17th century, and slave trading, and this and that. Nothing.
It's incredible.
Well, and the village, the various kinship groups in the village are four major kinship groups. Nothing, Yes, of course, but they knew about their ancestor. That was about at the time of Brazza. One older guy knew somebody who was older than the Brazza by maybe half a century, but that was it. So, what could I do? Well, I thought at the time, I remembered that anthropology at that time, despite what they say now, but at that time was very anti-historical. The principle was that you could not know the social anthropology or study the social anthropology of a population by looking at documents written by other people, not by trained anthropologists. You have to be trained anthropologists to really do it. I thought that was nonsense. So since people did remember, as far as the Brazza, I thought, why shouldn't I write a book about that generation?
Right.
And study
19th century.
What's happening now, compare it with that dictionary of 1895. And there's another one of 1899 of a related language, so that I can see if the linguistics correspond or how they vary. And it will be a history, but for a short period.
Right, and actually the book is incredibly rich.
Right. So once I started on that, it worked out quite well.
Yeah. But I still wonder how you found out. Just on people's memory? I mean, because it's so rich in details about markets, about currency, about objects, about everything.
Well, you see, there are lots of sources that people do not realize are there. Like, all these objects, which Claudine drew and talked to people as she was drawing it. So they would explain what they meant to them, or whether they had seen some before, whether they were important or not important,
Well, for instance, they would buy them or produce
this is a knife of honor, and then we talk about why the shape and where they had gotten it from. So there's a whole history of objects. There's a history of farming too. They would talk about the cereals, the maize, corn that they grew, and how the maize, corn was in fact not their first crop, so that for spirits you needed the older crop, and there was only one big field of the older crop left in a village they named that was not very far from there. So we went there, and yes, it was pearl millet, the first cereal to come into the area. But that's history too.
It's fantastic.
And they explained how, with the arrival of the trade, that cassava came in as a result of the 19th century trade.
19th century?
Well, that's what they thought.
Yeah, probably earlier than that.
They knew, they knew that the corn was older, and that the corn also came from foreign countries.
Because cassava it's mostly with slave
Well, you
trade,
see,
right?
the corn is no problem because it uses the name for millet, and then for millet it simply says the really true sa, and then the word, and for corn it simply said the so and so.
Right.
But when you talk to farmers about what they farm and about the crops, and you talk to them about their families and about their parents, and how much pride did they give you for your mother, and was there a quarrel about it or not? But remember, this time depth is only 2 generations essentially. So if you talk to middle-aged, what look like middle-aged persons, 30 to 50, you already were talking about times that were 1920 and close to 1880s.
Right.
So that was one part.
So you end up with a very rich harvest.
Yes, but it was only half of the story. You see, because of the way we've gotten into this, I have not looked up any serious literature about sources for the taking before. I only knew that there had to be many, because the pool was the first place, and these were the years of competition. In fact, there are, I don't know how many.
You mean besides the very early ones?
100 or so different sources, only for the 1880s. All the journals of the time, the newspapers of the time, the pictures of the time, all of these, both in France and in Belgium.
Yeah, it's enormous because
they have Brazzaville, they have Kinshasa, and the whole propaganda, I would say, machine.
Yes.
All of that.
And the signing of the treaty with the...
Right, and I could use all of it after I came back, and then it made sense to use it.
Where did you go? Did you go to the French archives, or did you go to...
No, I saw the archives in Brazzaville at the time.
Okay.
Well, I wasn't supposed to go there because both the French embassy and the Congolese agencies thought that it was a risk to let an American, quote unquote, get into there.
An American agent.
Well, an American or a Belgian, it was even worse. In any case, there was simply somebody else who was doing research for us down there, who needed the archives, and they photocopied what they saw. It wasn't much, it was only 4 or 5 documents.
Oh, really?
Because they began too late.
So all the papers, the Brazza papers and all those were probably in France?
All of these were in France at the time.
Yes.
And you see, Brunswick had just studied them.
Yeah,
and then I just furnished the notes to Brunswick. That was after I came back. So
could you see them? Because he was publishing those books with Catherine Cochry about
you remember
Brazza mission.
That was the first part with Catherine, and then that part went to the point when the Brazza arrives on the Teke Plateau.
Okay.
And then for the next bit, for the next volume, he needed somebody for ethnographic noting, so he asked me. So I got the text, I got the whole text of everything, and furnished the footnotes, and in the same way I got...
So you got all the documents?
Well, because of the Brunswick, I knew exactly which kind of other documents were relevant. I told last time about how I found this book published in 1940, just the first months of the war, in Italy, in Milan, by somebody publishing the papers of somebody in Venice, who was the valet, who was the servant of the Brazza himself.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And and who saw through the eyes of a rural countryman in the Veneto in Italy, and it's an incredibly rich thing. I think it's about 500 pages long.
And it's in Italian?
It's in Italian, and it has and the Italian is not too Italian. It's Italian with some Veneto in it, but it's quite understandable. And it enriches things considerably, because you see...
Is it in your bibliography?
Yeah, oh yes.
Okay, yeah. I didn't pay attention.
It's under the name of Zorzi, which is the person who edited it, rather than the name of the person who wrote it. But this was just luck. You add all of that to the field work, and it was possible to get this done, to write this up.
How long did you stay? With
6 months.
6 months.
6 months, but I lost 3 days, I think, on the whole, or 4 days.
So it was very intense.
It was very intense. It was very helpful, and it was just one of those points in between that where you are free of everybody else. You can do just that and nothing but that. And we were healthy. Claudine was healthy. We had no major.
When you were in the Cuba Kingdom, it was like that too, right? Only you were alone, but you were pretty...
Yes, but I was often sick.
Oh, okay.
I was often quite ill.
Plus you had your military service at some point. I mean, I forgot if it was at the same time when you were among the Cuba. I mean, it reminds me of this kind of bubble, when you're you're young, you're just working.
Yes, of course. No, that was fine. And with the Cuba, I was learning a lot about very basic things. With this field work, I had the experience of.
Right.
I had a lot of experience by then. So we arrived, for instance, with everything we needed, and all within the weight that the airlines allow you, and that included beds, pails for water, really basic stuff, so that we were ready to go. We had decided that there would be no car. We wouldn't even bother to try with a car, and we would simply rely on local food. Essentially, then from time to time, we hoped to get back to Brazzaville and to get supplies. In fact, I think this happened 3 times. And all 3 times were when a local teacher who belonged to the same ethnic group as Massamba Deba and was well known to him. He was a well-known teacher. And who was teaching on the Teke Plateau, but he came from the north.
Is Mboshi, I think, is it? So I'm not sure anymore.
Well,
I think it's Mboshi, but I'm not sure.
Yes, he is Boshi.
Yeah.
It is northern Boshi, actually. Well, he had a car, and so when he needed to go to Brazzaville, we could go with him.
Perfect.
This is rather the reverse of the colonial situation.
But you must also have really, for the Teke people at Mbe, you must have looked like real, I mean,
Right.
insiders after a while. They must have trusted you a lot, living with them every day and talking with them every day.
Well, you talk to them every day. You, in the end, after 3 months, you knew everybody. And you knew who was rich and who was not rich and why they were rich and what was happening to the family and if they were quarreling or not quarreling and what, an incredible amount of information you get. In any case, so we got food from Brazzaville when we went there, which happened 3 times, I think, over the 6 months.
I hope you brought back some baguette.
And I brought back the literal baguettes when I went. There were also trucks running through there from Brazzaville to the Congo River in Gabé. And from time to time, they were like once a month, or a football club because there were soccer matches. And when we knew something like that would happen, we wrote to Ostam well ahead of time, told them to please buy this and that and give it to. And Ostam would never do this. I think they did it once. In any case...
How did you have news from Bruno? How did you get news from Bruno?
We got letters went with the stuff that you got.
Right, like how long did it
Well,
take?
not every month you got something.
Okay.
Look, this was a time when there were no instantaneous communications. And people were used to this, Now, if you think that, I can't talk to my child today, it will have to be tomorrow, you tend to be nervous. But then, you tend to think the child is well cared for.
No news, good news.
And how could you get news anyway, There was no radio, there was no radio communication. There was one radio receiver in an ordinary radio, in town, and that's how we learned that Kennedy had been murdered. And we said, forget it, you must have misunderstood this. This is not possible.
So you didn't believe the news?
We don't believe this for two days, and then, the 3rd day, we went to listen to the radio together, and sure enough, he had been killed. And moreover, his killer had been killed. And the two were saying, well, those Americans, they really have no civilization.
Barbaric.
Right. So that's how it went. And that's how it came out. Now, what happened with the purpose of this book? Well, first, its more precise purpose was, as I had said, to show that you could describe the society and the culture of people, even if you were at a time before the present, and that there had been problems with the ethnographic present and the usual that you could avoid, that you could date things. It would make things different. Now, the book was actually well received. There were 2 important reviews. One was by, what's his name? The Congo specialist, McAfee, who found that it was not anthropological enough. There was not enough anthropological theory in it. And it smelled a little bit of anti-theory, which it was.
That's true.
And, but then in fact, this book was 2 books. It was a history book and it was an anthropology book. But they were tied together.
No, I don't agree. I like the balance because you describe...
Well, you see, I didn't agree either, but I wasn't going to criticize this. Actually, the plan the overall plan in the book of the little society and the large society and so on is taken from anthropology, but American anthropology. And
because it's also
Mexican
institutions,
studies.
commerce, this kind. I mean, it's.
Well, there was.
As far as I remember, you don't have a chronological outline, do you? I know. The overall chapters are not chronological. You're not.
No, they're not necessarily chronological.
No, they're more thematical, like an anthropology book.
Yes, the first part is completely anthropological, and one of the critiques
is that. True. And the second part is more.
The second part is more historical.
Chronological. Yes.
And that's what McGaffey thought. The first part looked too much like the ethnographic survey of Daryl Ford.
Yeah, but why do you care about anthropological theory?
But in any case, so that was that. The second interesting review was one by Claudine Vidal, who basically found that this was not possible. That
you had invented everything.
That it looked, you see, it was all magic mirrors. That what I saw.
You were projecting your own.
What I saw in the 1960s, I was projecting back into the 1890s, and that what I read in the 1890s, I was adding artificially to the 1960 data.
Interesting.
And that ethnography could not be historical, essentially. Well, that prompted, a whole debate in Cahiers Africain.
Cahiers
d'études africaines, in which, amongst others, Chrétien, Persson, I think, and two others, wrote back to say, no, this is not possible, this is history, this is not, it is not...
So they were supporting you?
Right, they were supporting me, and then she wrote back, and she had an answer to this, and it was called L'ethnographie à l'imparfait. And
ethnography is the imperfect tense?
In the imperfect tense.
Or in the past tense?
No, she meant the imperfect, the not perfect tense.
Right. You're right, we have to keep the
right. In any case, so that was a debate. It was interesting because I had expected the same sort of debate in England, but I didn't get it. Although it was published by the International African Institute, there were no notable English reviews by social anthropologists. There were sort of review. This book came out. It talks about that, except for Daryl Ford, but he didn't write. He wrote an opinion about the book, but he didn't publish it. He liked it. But then he was half American anthropologist too.
Interesting.
In any case, so that was one. But what I would like to indicate now is that, when we are talking about historical anthropology, you wonder what that is. Well, this is one part of it. And when I wrote the Children of Woad, that comes later, it is also very much an anthropological book. If you start as an anthropologist and you read it that way, you can see that it is anthropology with history. If you start as an historian, you see it as history with, some social science in the back. But in some senses, the Children of Woad is more historical anthropology even than this, because it is more comparative. It includes comparisons for all over the world, but in very few sentences. And it discusses major theories of change and how change could or not occur or did occur, say economic change, or why it is difficult to study religious change or changes in ideology because of the sources, yes, but there are also anthropological problems. So it's much more mixed historical anthropology, in fact, than this one. On the other hand, there is no historian who read that who suggested that it was not history.
Right. Yeah.
And by that time, that's only 4 years later than this, the whole issue of anthropology and history, had been laid aside, and it was no longer a major
issue,
bone
so
of
it has been
contention.
accepted as a possibility.
Well,
or it was not just interesting for people.
It was not just an interesting issue anymore. You have to see the background to this. At this time, it was still an issue, and later on it would become an issue again. It was still an issue because, in fact, in research concerning Africa, history had completely pushed anthropology aside, except in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
But everywhere else, Africa had been the domain for anthropology in the 1950s in Great Britain. It was important, not the most important, but important in the US. And when you come into the 1960s, you see historians getting the grants and anthropologists not getting the grants. Well, that's a background to this.
It's really interesting. I never thought about that.
You see,
I never knew that.
If you look at Northwestern University, it is a very, very telling story. In 1960, it was at its height. And Herskovits was getting all the attention. That's before I came. Was getting all the attention. And it was all anthropology. It was a department of anthropology and so on. But in the 60s, the grant money came to UCLA, came to Boston, and came to Madison, but not much to Northwestern, because anthropology was no longer considered that important. Mm-hmm. And that was happening on the level of Africa, but it was also happening on the level of Indian studies, South Asian studies. Mm. And it is one of the things to keep in mind that this quarrel with what in fact was Catherine Vidal, but also her mentor.
Jean-Pierre Chrétien?
No. The mentor and the founder of Cahiers d'études africaines, a very famous
anthropologist.
Les Brazzavillois, Ballandier.
Ballandier, yes, of course, Georges Ballandier.
Was also Ballandier had.
I was thinking, because for me, the sociologist is not an anthropologist. Well, he claims he's a sociologist.
Right.
Yeah.
No, Ballandier is a sociologist. And you see, he'd written a little history of the Congo Empire, the Kingdom of Congo. But he
claimed that sociology could be a dynamic kind of historical one.
And he claimed this, but he did not. There had been this. You see, he had not done what historians do: pay attention to time. In his Kingdom of Congo, he would take sources from 1500 and 1700 and mix them all up.
It's a very flat book.
And
I can never use it.
You see, I had criticized it in an article in the journal Africa. Mm. And therefore told me, he's going to be furious. And in fact, that's another thing behind this whole.
No, but what you're saying, and I didn't know, is that the effort to combine anthropology and history came both from historians like you, and Ballandier, anthropologists, but in a way, the historians won.
You see, at the same time, here in the US, there was a whole fight between so-called ethno-historians of the American Indians, of the people, the original people here, and other who were more sociologically inclined, the anthropologists saying, no, all this history is no good. Mm. So it's not just in Africa, it's a whole broader from that.
Really interesting.
Now, it is a book, and it's a field work that's different from all the others I've done. It's different in that Claudine was there, and not just because Claudine was there, but because Claudine was stuck with about illustration, because the camera went wrong in the fourth or fifth day that we were there, and she only had bigs, and so she began to draw, and that attracted people, and she was interested anyway in what we were doing. So she had bought this little stool, very little, just off the ground, they have in the area, and she would begin drawing on any kind of paper that we would find first. and people would come and they would sit and they would discuss all sorts of things. And this created an atmosphere that was completely different from question and answer.
Right.
You see, it was also different from what the Ostom people, researchers were doing, because they tended to go out on Monday mornings, come back on Fridays to Brazzaville, and never be there over the weekend. And they were in the style, what you might call the administrative style.
Yes.
And people are sensitive, very sensitive to that. So that helped, and it helped that we were relaxed. It helped that we bought all the food we could locally, and that when there was no food locally, or very little, we also had very little. We also went, and this is again, Claudine is a part that you cannot sort out in all of that. That we went to an epidemic of measles, and where the village children got measles, and we did a little we could do. It wasn't very much, but so we went over with the whole dying and grieving, and then coming back and being happy that the other children were saved. All of that, that forms stronger bonds. And that, for instance, is why I was able to include a whole palaver written by hand, as in speed as it proceeded.
Because you were admitted.
Because I was admitted into this what was actually a family settlement.
I remember
it made it very pleasant for us, and it made it very pleasant for the Joe. The only mistake I made was the one about publication. I should have published this in French. I wanted to write it in French, but at Ostom, they told me, no, we'll boycott you and we'll get to all the French publishers, because this is where the PhD of Sorey has to be. Has to
and he
have
never
priority.
did you
Yes, he wrote his PhD in the end. He did publish it. In France you have the Lille program for a PhD publication.
Right.
It was published there, and it's very long, and it's very geographic.
Yes, very long.
It's like in this place it rains 3 days a year, but that sort of thing.
See, the one I think about who was working in the other part of the Koukouya plateau is
Bonafé.
Bonafé, yes.
And we got along very well with Bonafé.
But it was not the same place, really.
No,
it
but it was
Teke,
close.
but in a different place.
So we read each other's stuff. It was close. I visited him in Paris. We visited him in Paris later on. And then, of course, as you know, he killed himself at one point. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that at all.
He committed suicide.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
And he killed himself. I'm not too sure for what reason, so I will simply not go into it.
Not long after publishing his book?
No, so that's why there is no major book. He has 2 or 3 quite important
and I think you're
articles.
right, it would have been probably much more impact if it had been published in French. But I have
and then you see, I had until, so I may still have some, what was going to be his PhD in handwriting.
Who?
I have it.
The PhD of whom?
Of the Koukouya, of Bonafé.
Oh, really?
So I had the text that he wanted to publish, but was going to work on more,
But he published it. I have it.
Yes, he published it eventually.
It was actually, it's a strange publication because it's written on a typewriter.
Yes.
But it's still,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, that's that copy.
I had a couple questions for you. So I remember it's not a question, the first is a very short comment, but I remember a very long time ago when I first got to meet you. I really remember when you told me about how important it was that you were not able to take pictures of objects, but Claudine was drawing them.
Yes.
And when you draw, you get to learn so much more because you have to pay attention to all the details, and then you incorporate what people say it's a completely different process than taking a picture. That I remember you told me that.
You see, it's a human
as
relationship
a young researcher.
That's different from the relationship, which is the foreign relationship.
Yeah, and so, getting the knowledge about the object is completely different. The other comment I have is that for me the Tio Kingdom, one of the very important contributions of the Tio Kingdom is not only the historical knowledge and the anthropology and the linguistic, but it's also that it's a case that later on you exploit actually in Pass in the Rainforest about this very interesting society that is politically very decentralized, but brought together by this cult, right, by the Nkobi charm. And it's a very strange kind of formation, right?
Right. Well,
yeah, because the person, the king in charge of the Nkobi, he's a king in a very different way than most of the kingdoms around, right? So it's actually a fascinating case in political history as well.
Yes, no, and I saw that at the time, but it reminds me of another thing. You see, this history, this kind of history, or the Kuba kind of history, is one that's a general history. Yes, politics are important, and they're in fact central in both books. Political questions of politics, but in fact the books are about the whole way of life.
Yes, it's a total history. A total social history.
It's a social history, and its ancestors lie more in the Anal, the Anal direction than in any other.
But
so
still,
it could have been more technical and more just this and that, but it would have lost.
Right, but still, I think in the kind of survey of the different political systems in West Equatorial Africa, it's a really interesting case.
Yes.
Again, of a very large polity that's held together by a cult of a charm, and not really any kind of centralized or quasi-centralized.
No, you see, and this one was interesting.
It's very different from the Congo Kingdom. It's very different
from the Congo Kingdom.
Very different from the Kuba Kingdom.
Yes, but it's also quite interesting because by the 1880s there are two networks. There is the economic network that's very strong, and what theoretical texts suggested at the time is that the political structure would have adapted itself to the economic one. It didn't, and that it was so decentralized and relying
very flexible
and relying on what authors used to call le pape des particules, this papal structure. Yes, I know that's what makes it so interesting.
And the other thing that I think is also very important for the history of the 19th century is at the end when you show the impact and how of the coming of Europeans and how all these institutions and the Tio are adapting and also in a way the deterioration also of some of these.
Yes, but societies. You see it also shows.
There's not that many histories that show, that really show on the ground with many details what happened during the first contacts
no, that's true.
Yeah.
No, and you see, what first struck me in rereading it and looking at it again is the contrast between the first chapter and the last. The first chapter is a typical ethnographic chapter about basic social structures or something like that, and in the area of Mbe. The last chapter shows that the area of Mbe was by 1963 a dormitory for Brazzaville, that the national politics were intertwined with the local politics. In other words, that this was not an isolated folkloric remnant, this was part of the modern
and it
country.
had become a satellite to a large extent.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you read carefully, you'll find parts in the middle where it shows, it shows the end of contact, intensive contacts between the French and the Tio King Ilo at the time because it was no longer needed. But it's interesting to see how even then you can already show changes in the behavior of major chiefs, changes in the patterns of goods that arrive and that leave. And it's there, you know, but you have to look for it. And then you skip to the period after the Brazil and you see how these forces, you know, these supposed general forces, how on a concrete level that they do infiltrate and you know, and change the quality of life.
So in a way it was a precursor to being colonized, in a way.
Yes, in a sense, yes.
In a sense it was, yeah.
Right.
I think it's a great book.
Well,
it's one of my favorites, really.
No, you see, it's one of our favorite because nothing went wrong. We had a happy time. It was really good. And then, you know, being colonized is in a bit of the same. I mean,
it's revisiting a very happy time being colonized.
You see,
and your tie, your very strong memory and tie with the cook.
Well, you see, no, you also have to look at the amount of creativity that goes into making a book, and that has nothing to do with the substance of it. You see, it's the layout of being colonized that was so inspiring. That, you know, here I have 10 pictures. Which one will go best with this text? Well, no, which is a text that should be read when you summarize it that way.
Right.
And it's fun, you know, to work and get this concrete, finally, to a concrete image and a concrete book.
Right.
And with this book, it's about the same. How do you combine topics that are so diverse into a single book? And how do you, what do you do with the pictorial elements, with the maps and the tables, and how do you present this and how do you present that? So that was one of the interesting things. It's also interesting in that, you see, you don't see the linguistics there on top, not very much. But if you look at that book, take for instance the chapter on what people cultivate, you will find that it's loaded and loaded with linguistic terms.
Right.
It was one solution to the problem of how to present the linguistics. You see, up to then, and later, the publishers did not like to add anything linguistic longer than two pages to any book. And it was something that you didn't do, especially for histories.
Right.
Because linguistics were expensive to publish because of these special characters and you know, you had to pay more attention to the printer and so on than otherwise. And this was one way. I managed to get a lot in it without...
I forgot if you have an appendix because I was looking at the Children of Wood. The Children of Wood has like 100 pages.
Well, the Children of Wood is the next stage.
Right.
You see, there is much more in it than this.
Yeah.
See, if I just compare...
The narrative is longer in this one.
The narrative is longer.
And so the linguistics are embedded
and
into
the linguistics are all in footnotes.
Right.
Or in tables, you know. But so the Children of Wood's solution is better because it's more... it's easier to find. I mean, this is not so easy to find.
Right.
It's easier to find.
It's more synthetic.
And it's more related because it gives more indication of how it is related or not to general Bantu stuff. Whereas here you see you can find it from this table in the end, but it's much more complicated. But nevertheless, I managed to get at least this amount in.
Yeah.
And then you see the bats in the rainforest.
You could never do that today, by the way, unless you're
well,
really
that's what you think.
Forget about it. I mean, unless you really write a book in historical linguistics.
The Children of Wood was possible basically because it was this press.
Yeah.
And it was willing to do it. Now, Bats in the Rainforest is the real one. And I mean,
you had to cut so much, right?
No. So I did all the work, you know, and I got Bats in the Rainforest which has this long list of
Yes.
words arranged by etymologies
Right.
and so on at the end. And it was a breakthrough because others had not succeeded in doing this.
Yes.
There is no printer, no publisher had accepted this.
But still, I remember that you were really unhappy because you had to cut half of the manuscript, didn't you?
Well, I cut half of the appendix anyway, but it worked. At least it worked.
Yeah.
And it was an example, so it could be followed, and it was followed.
Yeah, but
later
I'm
on.
not sure you could do it.
But
now.
then you see the next stage is the one when you come to Schönbrunn,
Yeah, right. It's
where
just-
you
yeah.
simply take the linguistic material, publish it, make it very thorough, and publish it completely separately as a book in historical linguistics.
Right.
And you can do that. It has its advantages, of course, it's more thorough. It has its disadvantages in that if you are interested in the history and historical problem, you're not always thinking of having that other book immediately next to you. So that's it.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.